I think it would be a good place to start by explain the term newsonomics and how it's going to, obviously, in the digital age here, really shape the way we consume and the way we use news.
So what I followed, I've been an analyst now for 10 years after a long career in print publishing, newspapers, and magazines. And what I do is I follow the money. Basically, the big question here is an audience. We're all consuming lots of news and much more news on our phones and tablets and all than we ever were. The problem is the pain of the journalists. So I have focused now for 10 years on how people are going to make money. How are they going to be able to make enough money to pay journalists? And the big problem in the U.S. and now increasingly in Europe is that we've lost a huge number of journalists, more than 20,000 daily journalist jobs lost in the U.S. So I look at advertising, I look at circulation, I look at the paywalls that have gone up. I look at all these things to try to figure out what's working, what's not working, and what may work.
I actually sat down a while ago with Jonah Peretti, and the CEO of BuzzFeed, and you walk away from the conversation, clearly the man is brilliant. But in explaining the modeling, and this was at the very beginning of BuzzFeed, sure, to try and find out these quick consumable bites of journalism, if you take out the journalist part of it that said, my God, you can't tell a story in 30 seconds or 45 seconds, and then you transition to the business model. I understood where he was going, but explain and tell me why I'm wrong, that I got the sneaking suspicion that we could be looking at another tech bubble when you look at the revenues of a BuzzFeed and you look at the valuations of a BuzzFeed, and they're not alone right now. Before we get into their grand plan, the BuzzFeeds of the world, how do we, basically justify or make sense of how much they're worth and how much VC guys will throw money at them versus how much they're generating or even have the promise to generate in terms of revenue?
So they're generating about $125 million, which is not a lot of money by many media standards. And you're right, their valuation is about $850 million in the last round of funding. This is a company that has been developed incredibly well by Jonah Peretti and his top lieutenants, and it is a company meant to be sold. It is a company that keeps on getting more and more investment. You see, it gets the venture money, and so does Vox, and Vice is taking on investments, and Mike and the rest of them. They all see the fact that there is a gold rush going on, especially for millennials readers, somewhat with native advertising, and they're believing that a Disney or a Murdoch is going to want to buy these companies because these old media companies have a big problem generating enough new business and coming up with their own models. So that's how these companies are built. It isn't 1999 where we have these companies, and I saw a number of their balance sheets where they have very little revenue and nowhere near profits, but BuzzFeed is making a little money. But you're right, the valuation is huge. Now, we can understand that valuation even before this presumed deal with Facebook that I wrote about this week and is very much in the news. BuzzFeed can take a piece of content, whether it's a cat video or an investigative story of abuse, and of course they do both. This is their high-low journalism. They invest in that creation, whether it's a little bit of money or a lot, and then they can now take that and push it out across the globe. So they have a half dozen international sites in addition to the US one. And now if they're going to put all their content throughout Facebook, that one piece of content costs no more to distribute everywhere and have omnipresence. This is a different business model. So it does make some sense from a venture point of view if you can have omnipresence. The question is how much money will follow in advertising.
And you speak about, in your column, ubiquity, and I guess it's got different applications or definitions depending on who you're talking about, but that's terrific. But if you're now not finding basically a home base to go to and you're trying to spread it out over as many platforms as you can, are people going to sit through an ad if they just want to watch the cat video on a totally different platform, monetizing it by, I understand the whole idea is to get as big as possible so you drown out the competition, but at a certain point, don't you still have to make money over wherever they go to look at it?
So look, we can stay with cats and BuzzFeed, which is pretty much a fundamental part of their business model. So you have the cat video, which some people would find incredibly cute, but they're also producing for Friskies and other cat food manufacturers advertising, their native advertising push, right? So they create these ads that too are very cute, and they are discrete ads. They are different from the videos. They then put those out across the entire internet, and they're getting paid by Friskies, not just for you viewing that Friskies ad on BuzzFeed.com, but anywhere on the web. So in a sense, this whole idea of ubiquity, of using the whole internet, they're already doing it. The native advertising, taking the Friskies example, is going everywhere. And the more that it's seen anywhere, it doesn't need to be on BuzzFeed, the more BuzzFeed gets paid. So there is a business model behind this. It's just harder to see and very different than the usual advertising model we're used to on media.
I see Vice now is going to create programming for HBO that's news, and original investigative reporting. I think 13 or 25 episodes. I'm sorry, I don't remember the total outlay.
Right.
But is there still a model, really, whether you're print or broadcast in whatever form, that at a certain point, people just don't want to aggregate. They're going to want original content. And have we reached the tipping point where you can cut only so much to the bone? There still needs to be content, and it can't all be the same thing.
Well, definitely. And you see that the readership of good media, good news media, is still very, very high, whether it's the New York Times or it's Vice. And Vice has its own audience. It has its own loyal audience. And the fact that it is Vice on HBO, it's a very good nesting of brands, essentially. I think of Vice very differently than the rest. Vice is really an ESPN for the new age.
Yep.
They've got 4 or 5 ways to make money, just like ESPN does. And I think that if you look at the numbers, what's fascinating, and we can go back to what we call traditional media or legacy media, right? The New York Times, for instance, you go back to 1995, and they had about 1.5 million paying subscribers, pre-digital, all print. Today, they have between 1.5 million and then 2 million on Sunday. All the change that's happened for the last 20 years, and the number of paying subscribers is the same. So that tells us something about who's willing to pay, how they're willing to pay, and it also tells us that a BuzzFeed is working a totally different terrain of understanding this ubiquity of the internet and finding ways to make money in it. So these are parallel. New York Times, same number of customers, but most of them are digital, and they have advertising like they used to. They're struggling, but they're creating a future. BuzzFeed finding another way to do it, Vice finding still a third way. So there are many ways to do it today, and I do think the idea of brand is still hugely important. And each of those brands has resonance with certain groups of readers.
Ken, use the Times as an example with that partnership with BuzzFeed. Are they getting it both ways, or are they risking being half pregnant? Whatever people think, they have an effective paywall method right now where you know where you're going to go if you want Times content, you're going to pay for it. Right. With what they're trying to do with BuzzFeed, are they just creating more platforms, or they're cannibalizing their own unique place where you go to consume it online?
So when we look at what they might do with Facebook, right, we're talking about what they're going to do with Facebook, as BuzzFeed is doing. The question is all in the details here. I do not expect that the Times is going to take all of its content and put it for free on Facebook like BuzzFeed says it's going to do. It makes much more sense that the New York Times will use Facebook, as it has. It will just experiment in different ways, and I think in deeper ways, to try to find new readers and also to leverage the advertising strength of Facebook. So I expect a limited amount of Facebook to have New York Times content. It's also possible that you can read all you want of the New York Times on Facebook, but you have to sign in, just like you sign in with a username and password. That's exactly what the New York Times is doing on Flipboard and has been doing it for 2.5 years. So you could read all the times you want on Flipboard, but you have to be signed in and still a paying subscriber. That's another possibility. So until we know these details, how much content do you need to be signed in, how much advertising they're going to make. I don't think we should leap to conclusions that they're dropping their model, which they can't do. 62% of all the Times revenue now is reader revenue, so they're not going to throw that down the toilet.
Do we have any empirical data yet as it relates to millennials? What kind of news they're going to want in 10, 15 years from now as everybody fights over the landscape and the same consumer and user? Do we see a distinct difference from what their parents wanted? Or does everything have to be a certain amount, whether it be length or characters, because the attention span is just not going to be there? Do we know enough yet to say, forget about where they go to get it, what they really want?
I don't think we do yet. And I think these are really evolving behaviors. As you know, the millennial generation isn't a new generation. It's just coming of age, and it's being recognized as a market. If you go back to 2010, before the tablet and before the paywall, and people would say, people only read snippets, Google search, you read something, you read a headline, you're out of there. The tablet comes along. Steve Jobs gives us the tablet, and people go like, whoa, the reading habits here look just like print. 30 minutes on a session, stay with a brand. Now tablets are basically flat, only 4% up last year, and smartphones are getting bigger. I just saw a study this morning that said people are reading longer stories on larger smartphones. So, and that's not just millennials. So the form factor, how large the screen is, what kind of content they read, I think will be highly variable. And it's, I guess I would end up by saying, you know, older generations always look at younger generations and try to figure out if they're a different species. They're not. They want news. The millennials clearly are smartphone oriented. That is their main way of taking in the world, including news. But they do read medium and longer form stories. It's going to depend a lot on the quality of it. And there's always going to be an elite in any generation that's going to want higher quality news and be willing to pay for it.
Ken, I finally am starting to sound like the people who say whippersnappers. That's become me right now. But Ken, I really appreciate a few minutes with you again. Ken Doctor here, Capital New York. Thank you so much.
My welcome.